How many people here have heard of forest therapy or forest bathing or Shinjin Yoku? Okay, so maybe it's about half. I found when I was doing some research a few years ago on the internet, and I saw the term and I sort of chuckled at it because I thought, wow, forest therapy. I'm the guy, I'm the ecologist. I spend time out in nature all the time. And yet when I did the forest therapy training, after I realized that I felt called for it, I recognized that I hadn't really been spending time in nature where I was really in nature. So I was calm, relaxed, not thinking about the next photograph I could take, the next bird I could identify, the next trillium I could show my wife and have her say, okay, enough, you're ruining the walk for me. So all of these were really good signs, and of course the close people in our lives are the ones that will often reflect and be really positive but also honest to us. So the talk title really relates to the name of the organization that I co-created with Skye Boughtonhouse in Ireland, and also my wife, Amola Porchuk, who has done a lot of work because of being a psychologist and introducing a new aspect, which is more client-centered or a one-on-one approach. Forest therapy, as it's practiced in most parts of the world now, is more of a group thing, but we're moving into training people to do smaller groups and sometimes one-on-one. And as you'll see, it's really exciting that this organization has its first training just outside of London in the Living Centre, which also has a great booth here. A lot of people don't know about the jewel that the Living Centre is right within our community. So medicine for the mind, body, and spirit or soul. And while this seems to be something new that started off in Japan in the 1980s, of course, indigenous cultures around the world have been doing it for millennia. And a lot of our own ancestors have been forest bathing. But what's new in recent decades, of course, is that we've become a lot more centered on success and on remembering things and on, all sorts of things that we think define us as being an individual of success versus happiness and simple things. So starting off, like I mentioned, you might not recognize this picture, but this is me back in the early 1990s when I was studying rattlesnakes in Georgian Bay. And growing up on a farm was really great. And then when I saw the opportunity that I could work with wildlife, it was a whole new world. And to learn plants and animals and fungi was really inspiring in itself. And one of the main reasons why we have an event like this, right? Because the world is at a turning point right now. Are we going to recover things or stay on the same path? And a lot of that same path that we talk about is the path of the brain that wants to create more, do more, be more successful versus being satisfied or finding ways to do things that are also progressive but restorative in nature. So I did live off the grid for 12 years, and this was kind of the height of doing research, but it really felt empty for a while. I spent at times weeks on my own, isolated and really connecting with nature. And for me, my own personal gifts as far as connecting with nature, I found were individual animals. So while I researched animals, I also had a close connection with some encounters that were really surprising. And this was really big for me later on when I did the training. This is a yellow-billed cuckoo. I profiled this bird earlier in my talk. It's an amazing forest bird that loves more open savannas. It feeds on caterpillars. It was one of the more common nesting birds in the area. This one was in shock from a trauma, and I found it. And it spent a lot of time with me for a couple of hours until I warmed it up, flew away onto a branch. And these types of encounters that I had, I ended up having an owl, a great horned owl in my kitchen for about 3.5 weeks at one point. And then I found an eagle, a mature bald eagle on the edge of my laneway, and I put a big blanket around it and brought it into my cabin. And all of these, for me, were signs that there was a deeper connection, much so to the point now that I often describe myself as a recovering scientist. And then I was so fortunate. If you get the chance, I know there's not a lot of time left here today, but there's an amazing native plant nursery. There's so many. There's one here and over here, but there's one at Aamjiwnaang First Nations. And you can go and see all the plants they have offered there. I was so fortunate to get a contract to work with Aamjiwnaang. You may know this community as the only place in the world where the birth ratio of girls to boys is 2 to 1. Almost every family has somebody with cancer or has died from cancer in the last 5 years. It's the epitome of the First Nations community given land that's now completely surrounded by petrochemical refineries. Pollution is strong in the water and the air. And so this community was seeking someone from the outside to lead a traditional medicinal native plant inventory. And I, being the scientist and was getting really interested in plants, I really wanted to do this project. This was, for me, very exciting. I was so happy that I got the contract. Part of it was to bring in native elders from different parts of the province. And this guy here that you see, Isaac Day, when we started doing our first plant identifications and I started telling all the native people on the tour what I knew from my book knowledge of native plants, he looked at me at one point and he said, "Hey you," and I said, "Yeah, Isaac?" And he said, "You're moving like an animal too much. I want you to slow down and act like a plant." And I didn't know really what he meant, right? So I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Sit with this bloodroot plant right here and I'll tell you when to get up." I said, "Okay, what do I do?" And he said, "Talk to the plant. It'll tell you what you need." And so I sat there and I was thinking 10 minutes, right? And an hour went by, another hour went by. Before I knew it, my legs were falling asleep to the point where I thought, are these hallucinations or is this plant actually talking to me? And I had a wonderful conversation. It's kind of like when somebody in this new age says, throw it up to the universe, ask the universe. Well, I was asking the bloodroot plant, and I was responsible, I felt, for bringing in a lot of this medicine from these native elders. And to me, this was one of the biggest lessons. And I got so many inspirational messages from this bloodroot plant. And if you know a little bit about the ecology of this plant, they're just fascinating. They team up with ants to feed each other, essentially. Ants will collect their seeds and rear their young with the allosomes on the seeds. And then the ants will take the plants and plant the seeds and plant them throughout the forest. So it's a wonderful story. And they're also one of the first native plants to flower in the spring. So they have all sorts of pollinator activities around them. And they're also, here's the bloodroot. They also grow up with this cloak. If you look at the plants on the left there, it looks like they're wearing a cloak. And they come out of the earth and they bear amazing messages. And when I talked to him afterwards, he had a smile on his face because he knew that I got what I needed to get out of the plant. And it was the first time that I'd ever really had a conversation with a plant. And since then, I've written about conversations with plants, and I've also found people all over North America that teach courses on how to converse with plants. So you can see why I called myself a recovering scientist, right? This guy's talking with plants. But when I went to the forest therapy training, these dialogues were a part of the training, and I'll explain more in a minute. So here I am in California in 2015, not really that long ago. A beautiful area, Sugarloaf Ridge State Park, which has since been completely burned in the wildfires a few months ago. Sections of where we weren't touched, but it was an amazing place. And so a lot of us from all parts of the world, there were people from New Zealand, from Europe, and from the States, and one other person from Canada, actually from Kitchener. And we did this 8-day intensive training, and I was really open to it, and I was really looking forward to it. And a lot of the theory is on H. Shields and John Young training, but also about how to collect and harvest plants for tea ceremony. What is the practice of council that not just First Nations people in Canada or the United States have used, but all over the world. And all of this combines essentially so that you can become a guide to lead people through nature, to actually help them become childlike again, right? Because you know the occasion when you feel like you're childlike and you feel the bliss, you don't feel encumbered, you don't feel the stresses. Well, that's actually a regular adult state that we aren't in very much anymore. For me, my animal connection was super heightened when I started seeing pileated woodpeckers flying very close to me. The main trainer and the founder of the US organization said, we don't have pileateds here, we had them decades ago. And I said, well, I haven't really told you my background, but I know a lot about birds and animals. And he said, I believe you, but you're not in your home area and we don't have pileated woodpeckers here. With saying that, a pileated woodpecker flew right towards us. We turned and looked at it. It was heading right for our heads. We ducked. It flew right up over our heads and then over on the other side and then off and landed on a tree just like this and started pecking. And he turned to me and he said, we do now, right? And I was like, yeah, I just couldn't believe it. And so there were snakes and there were lizards and all sorts of things I hadn't seen before. And the deeper and deeper I got into the training, I recognized that I had some sort of connection inside of me with animals, which a lot of us do, that is there. And I know some people talk about whether it's St. Francis. I know an amazing guy who's writing a book on this. He's back there, Eugene, talks about St. Francis a lot. And beyond religious examples, a lot of people we know can connect with animals. And I'm not saying I had that extreme of an experience, but there were these lizards. I used to study snakes and turtles. That used to be a big part of my research. And so when I saw these alligator lizards that you see on the right here, they would run away from me at the beginning of the training. Then by the end of the training, I can remember coming down from the final mountain on my last day, and I said to this lizard in the photograph here, as it ran away from me, no, I don't want you to go. I want to spend some time with you. So I walked over slowly to the lizard and I bent down and I said, I want to get full headshots of you. These photos are the result of that. And then I said to the lizard, I want to get close and I want to touch this lizard. I put my hand on the back of the lizard, and then for the first time during the 8 days, there were mosquitoes on my arm, and I actually got a couple of mosquitoes and I fed the lizard. And I'm not saying that this, maybe anybody can do this, but for me it was a real sign that the deeper I got into it and got away from my brain and what I had always thought was possible, the more things seemed possible. And these experiences with animals occurred in the practice walk on the final day as well, where a vulture landed on a tree right over atop a woman who was on one of our practice walks. And she said, she was the only one who noticed it, and I did as well. At the end of the walk, that section of the walk, she came over in tears, and I said, nobody else noticed that vulture. And she said, you did. And I said, I know I did. And she said, what's the story with the vulture? And she said, last week I was driving and one was feeding on the side of the road. It jumped up off the road, flew away, but came back right in front of the car, and I hit it. I pulled over, I picked it up. I'd never had a vulture in my hands. It was so warm and so soft and breathing, and it died in my arms. And she started to cry, and she said, what do you think this was for? And I said, I really don't know. I was just an observer. And she said, I think you know. And then her answer was, I think the vulture was just saying it wasn't my fault. And so these kinds of experiences, which don't really do well in my scientific brain, lead me to believe there's so much more. And that's not to say that science shouldn't be accepted, because we really do need to lead with science, especially in terms of climate change and really smart decisions that we need to make. But there are so many more things that we need to be open to. And this practice, and probably many other different types of healing modalities, really open us up to these possibilities. So when I got home, this was an interesting test. When I got home and my wife was like, oh my God, what happened to you? Because I was just walking on clouds, and I was breathing, and we were driving, and I noticed that somebody had cut grass. Like the smells, everything, my senses were so heightened. And then I went to the backyard and I saw a short-tailed shrew, which are mildly venomous, I should add. And they're really common in the city of London. And it scampered away, and I thought, why don't I just try this? Like, was I smelling some of the California wildfires or something? What was impacting my brain? Sure enough, I sat down and I stroked the head of the short-tailed shrew before it disappeared after probably about 30 seconds. So it wasn't just like it didn't notice I was there. So these things to me were big signs that I wanted this to be a big part of my life. So in addition to doing trainings, I then became on track to be a trainer for certifying forest therapy guides. This one was in Albion Hills, just north of Toronto. I went to Massachusetts to an amazing place in the mountains. I never knew that Massachusetts was so beautiful, and then I became a trainer. So some of the background, if we want to get into science a little bit about forest therapy, because I know there probably are skeptical people there, and it's not to try to convince, but I also have these thoughts in my mind, is that, for example, the universal hum of this planet. So what is our song? It's the same one that's out in the universe, and that song vibrates at 7.8 hertz. So it's said to be the sound considered the vibration of homeostasis. And it's the human, we train or we match ourselves through our sympathetic nervous system. When separated, a direct effect on melatonin production, metabolic processes, and circadian rhythms. So it has a negative impact. So essentially, when we are inside a lot, we are depriving ourselves from the hum because we have so many things inside of our homes that are vibrating and changing this frequency. Interestingly, this universal hum comes from the amount of lightning we have around the world. This frequency is actually going up for the first time in recent history that we know of. Some people say it's because we're having more storms because of climate change. Others say that it's a shift in consciousness that's happened. So we are, again, right at that crux of decision making. Another thing that's easily seen in this beautiful native plant called the maidenhair fern is something that we have, and I will describe it from my own personal view as deeply within our DNA, and this is fractals, patterns in nature. We don't understand why fully, but when you see a pine tree that has a needle that's on a branch, that's on another branch, that's on a huge branch, that's on the stalk of the tree, something inside of us really soothes. We feel at home. So these fractal patterns, whether we see them in clouds, in mountains, or in plants, really calms us. So some moments that are said to take our breath away are because of fractals or other things in nature that are so innate that we just don't know what it's from, but we know it feels good. Another one that's related to the first slide about science are circadian rhythms. These are daily cycles. And they're based on the rhythms of the rotation of the Earth on its axis and the cycles of light and dark. So again, most of us in North America, the average amount of time we spend indoors is 95%. What's 95% of one day? That's the vast majority of time we're in a factory, in an office, in our homes, in a car. So we're taking ourselves away from these rhythms, away from the universal hum, all of these things that are standard. And that, again, is more than enough reasons to get us outside. But again, just getting outside won't do the trick for some of us. Another reason is phytoncides, and we are about to announce the winner at the end of this of our hemlock trees. We've got some 7-foot hemlock trees. We also have business cards that we just got yesterday that are made out of wood from birch. We've put essential wood oils on these that you can get at any store. But if you go to nature and you get some sap from the tree, these essential wood oils we call phytoncides or pinene. Phytoncides are what the trees, conifers, so spruce, pine, cypress, they put this up in the air, and it's when you go to cottage country and you smell that amazing white pine, and that makes you feel so good. The plants are putting them out as a medicine for themselves. So the higher the concentration, the more these plants can ward off infestations from insects, fungal infestations, or bacteria. So this is plant medicine. And this is why a lot of our conifers in the city, especially our white pines, don't survive much past 100 years, whereas in forests they'll grow to 1,000 years because they don't have enough airborne medicine. They don't have enough water because of climate change. There are a lot of factors, but that's a really big part of it. So our cards have this smell right infused into them. So in addition to being plant medicines, they're also medicines for people. This was one of the first discoveries that they made in Japan in the early 1980s, when so many people in the city of Tokyo, which was approaching 40 million people, were getting sick from stress-related diseases. They did this huge study, and what they found was those people who spent more time in forests were less likely to spend time in hospitals, which of course is not surprising to most. But they isolated a lot of it to these essential wood oils called phytoncides. So when we breathe in phytoncides, it stops our hormone, our stress hormone production, which totally eases us. It's cortisol production. And so our shoulders drop. We all of a sudden get calm. We drop a lot of our worries. Our breath gets deeper. And then all of a sudden we're having a good time, we feel childlike, almost euphoric. That's what the cottage can do for us. And of course, there are other reasons involved in there. The fractals that you see when you see rocks and waters and pine trees. But this smell has a major effect. So again, if you're interested, you can go and sample these smells at our booth. And we will be drawing at the end of this for these trees. And of course with children, this is one of the walks where children kind of interrupted the walk, and it was a beautiful thing to see the naturalness. And here, again, in addition to people spending 95% of their time indoors, children have things like attention deficit disorder, which has skyrocketed. A lot of people in the field, like Richard Louv, now calls this nature deficit disorder, right? So when you deprive a child that is already a raw energy form, a bundle of joy, wanting to express life in every second, when you take them away from these things that nourish and provide energy, they get rangy. And so a lot of people are prescribing much more time in nature. And not just for behavior, but if you ask any child, even children of people who know a lot about nature, can you name me one or two native plants? Most kids, and even adults, will say maple leaf, and then maybe rose. So there isn't a lot of knowledge, and the knowledge, again, isn't really important for forest therapy. It's more the experiential opportunities that we have to open ourselves to our senses, and our senses beyond our thoughts, and even beyond our eyesight. So a lot of this I'll describe in a second. So when you go to a plant in nature, and if you can close your eyes and smell it, what that does is, and I did this today, a lot of us have at our booth, ask people to close their eyes and smell it. And the first thing that happens is a smile. And I did hear a few people say, I feel like a kid again. And so at the beginning of forest therapy walks, people are invited to get their balance and close their eyes, and we walk them through their senses of what they're experiencing in that particular moment. So this is a lot of detail on a map, but it's just to show you that a typical forest therapy walk isn't very far. It might be 1 to 3 kilometers. It takes you 3 hours to do this walk. And those red fires are breaks where you sit in a circle and you can optionally share what you've experienced in the invitation. There's a bit of a standard sequence. So the first thing we do at the very top that says number 1 is called pleasure of presence. And again, this is done with your eyes closed. And often when we do this and we draw attention to the sound, birds will come in very close and start to call right nearby. Or people will pick up the sound of wind going through the trees, or their own breath coming in and out of their bodies. And it's quite a remarkable experience. And then after that first invitation, we invite people to open their eyes and look for any type of movement. And this can be things really low to the ground, clouds in the skies. And again, it really is quite refreshing because people have had their eyes closed for about 15 or 20 minutes. And then we invite people to sit with a tree or to sit on their own for about 20 minutes to half an hour. And this might seem like really easy work if you're a forest therapy guide because everybody's just sitting there. But we invite people to say, you know, if you want to, you can introduce yourself to the tree. Tell the tree a little bit about yourself and maybe ask the tree about itself. And then if you want to deepen your relationship, ask the tree a question that nobody's been able to answer before. And we've had this happen quite a few times. Another name for this invitation is the gateway to grief, because the people have a lot of grief that comes up. And grief is okay. Grief is an emotion. And we've had some people tell stories of connecting with loved ones that they haven't seen in a long time, and certain insights that they feel that the tree has brought to their attention. And the detail and the level to which that happens is personal, but it's often shared by the group if people are interested in sharing it. And so again, it all is dependent, and it's all, it's not compulsory. People can share as much as they want. And then, so there are a few invitations where a guide can design something. I like to get people down to a creek and take their shoes and socks off and hang their toes in a creek. If they like, their whole foot. I recently met a guy who just finished his PhD at University of British Columbia called Feet in the Creek. His whole PhD was on the health benefits of sitting on the edge of a creek and putting your feet in there. And he's got publications coming up in scientific journals called Feet in the Creek. So that seems a little crazy to me. If you asked me a couple of years ago, I would have said, yeah, that's really ridiculous. But just talking to this guy and talking about the positive ions it takes, about the sound of the creek, about the temperature changes and what your body does, it's just remarkable the depth to which you can get into. This is a sample of a walk that I led at the University of Guelph's Arboretum. I go there every fall to 20 to 25 people. It's my largest walk where we walk through a boardwalk in a swamp. We sit in circles in the hardwood forest. We go into the meadows. And one invitation that I designed on my own, if you look at this bench here, I've got a couple of seedling pines, which we're actually giving away at our booth today. I actually came across somebody giving out these trees on the day I was doing the walk, and I thought, why don't I take one for each person and see what unfolds? And as I sat there with everybody, I said, I have a tree for you, and I gave them a tree, and I said, instead of going to talk with the tree or to connect with the tree, what can we do with the tree? And everybody sort of talked for a minute, and so we came up with the idea to introduce this young tree to an older tree somewhere in the Arboretum. So people walked around and were kind of matching and saying, okay, Mr. Old Tree or Mrs. Old Tree, you've been here for 100 years, it looks like. What kind of wisdom can you impart on this young tree? And it became really silly, and it became kind of fun. And it also became an amazing discussion about ancestors and about our responsibility to raise children well. It became a very important discussion when it came to the council. And the council, again, is the break between invitations, that fire that I showed you on the map where people sit in a circle, you pass around a talking piece, and then when it's your turn, you speak from the heart, you listen from the heart, you're lean of expression, and you're spontaneous. And this is where people really get into what their experience was. And some people might say, well, that's cultural appropriation. And council, if you look at it around the world, yes, to some degree, if it was taken that way. But so many indigenous cultures have used council. It's an amazing culture that should be brought back because it gives people the right to speak and not to be interrupted. We find it works really well. Our work, we give 1% of our proceeds to First Nations internationally and locally. And our first training, which is coming up in June, we're donating to Aamjiwnaad First Nation, and then another international cause. So yes, it could be cultural appropriation, but it's an amazing practice that if a lot of our cultures brought into our own, it would be so beneficial. Kids, we had my first practice walk I did with 20 16-year-olds from Catholic Central High School. Probably some of them are here today. It was just remarkable. The biggest hurdle was asking them to put their cell phones in a bucket at the beginning of the walk. And then when we got through it, the kids were just on cloud nine. They couldn't get enough of it. The insights were amazing. And for me as an ecologist who has actually gone at non-native plants and killed a lot of buckthorn and things that shouldn't be here, when it came time for the invitation to talk to a tree, a lot of these students went and sat with buckthorns and trees that I was thinking, why are they sitting with that? And I recognized, of course, it's an amazing creation. It's growing in the wrong place, it's having an impact, but these kids made amazing connections with them. Feet in the Creek, they love this. And then here's one that I developed for children that I've shared with guides around the world. On the right, you see a bunch of children sitting on a 100-year-old eastern cottonwood tree that is so big we couldn't get our arms around together. On the left is an eastern cottonwood tree between my thumb and my finger. That's how they float around for a good couple of weeks in June as a seed. So the invitation for children is, you are this seed. Float around across this lawn and this forest, and when you decide to plant yourself, sit down on the ground.
The website is like an online hub for finding out more about forest therapy, sharing the scientific studies that are coming out, taking your own practice to the next level where you can become a forest therapy guide or learn about upcoming forest therapy walks.